Happy Saturday. It's March 22nd, 2025, and you are listening to Morning Meeting. I'm Ashley Baker in London, where democracy still reigns.
And I'm Michael Haney in New York City.
And we are two of your airmail editors here to make sense of and hopefully provide somewhat of a break from the hard news of the day. But first, in the world this week, the 2-month ceasefire in Gaza has fallen apart as Israel has expanded its ground operations and Hamas has fired rockets at Tel Aviv. But we do have two pieces of good news. Tesla has recalled 46,000 Cybertrucks in the United States after the side panels started falling off. Additionally, in New York, the beautiful Frick Collection on the Upper East Side is reopening after a 5-year renovation. This Gilded Age mansion is one of the most beloved museums in New York City, and we are very happy to have it back. As usual, Airmail is the antidote to all of the news of the day.
Exactly. And first, supporters of the president have cheered his crackdown this week on anti-Israel protesters. But as our co-editor Alessandra Stanley writes this week, the Anti-Defamation League should really be condemning Trump rather than coddling him, and she'll explain why and what the ramifications could be. Then, speaking of ramifications and coddling, let's talk about Putin and Trump. Andrew Rifkin has an enlightening report this week on the man Putin has tapped to negotiate a Ukraine peace agreement with Trump. Would you be surprised to learn he's a rich Ivy League smoothie who spent time on Wall Street? It's a fascinating profile. And finally, continuing on the theme of organized criminal behavior, we're going to take a look at gangsters from a different time as dramatized in the new movie Alto Nights. It tells the story of the notorious New York crime bosses, Frank Costello and Vito Genovese, as they vied for control of the city. Most surprising of all, Costello and Genovese are both portrayed by one actor, Robert De Niro. And our writer, Michael Strago, is going to join us with his review of the film. So Ashley, where would you like to begin today?
Well, let's begin with Alessandra. Alessandra's the co-editor of Airmail and a longtime journalist with the New York Times who was a bureau chief both in Moscow and in Rome and knows something about observing the crazy world that we live in. Welcome, Alessandra.
Hello.
So in your view from here this week, you are taking on the Anti-Defamation League. Now, historically, they've been quite radical about calling out and combating anti-Semitism, but now it seems something has changed. What would that be?
Well, it isn't that they've changed. It's just that they are allowing themselves to be used by Trump, who is rather cynically using the pretext of fighting anti-Semitism to get rid of any kind of dissent or any kind of blowback, and it can be in academia, it can be anywhere in government. And unfortunately, ADL has stood by him because, they view him as someone who's a very staunch, loyal friend to Israel. But as we've seen, he can destroy a staunch and loyal friendship overnight if it suits him. So I don't know why he thinks that he would treat Israel any better than Ukraine if circumstances changed and it was in his advantage to side with, the enemies of Israel.
So take us through how this played out at Columbia.
Well, the student who was arrested for leading some of the anti-Israel protests was, legitimately in the United States. He's not an American citizen, but he's married to an American citizen who's 8 months pregnant. He has a green card. He has every possible legitimate reason to be in the United States. And maybe he isn't a great guy, but we don't know that. And it is shameful, I think, for an organization like the ADL to praise, I guess is what you'd say, is to allow Trump to scapegoat this kid. Because Trump isn't doing it because he cares about Jews. Trump is doing it because he cares about Trump. And he doesn't like campus unrest and he doesn't like protest. I mean, everything we've seen in the last week, be it about Jews or not about Jews, have never been about principle or any sort of form of, legal normalcy.
It seems like whenever Trump seems to stand for some particular cause or issue, like it just is a warning sign to us as journalists that we should be vigilant, right, about how he's using that to advance his own agenda. Is that really what we're seeing here with the case of anti-Semitism?
Definitely. And the thing that worries me the most and should worry the JDL is we've now learned there's nothing that Trump won't stoop to if he's in enough trouble or if it suits him. So why, if the economy collapses, if the stock market crashes, if things go badly, why wouldn't he go back to something that is tried and true and proven successful in the past, which is to scapegoat Jews? I mean, he could turn overnight. And suddenly all those Jews who gave him those millions and millions of dollars, Bill Ackman and all the others, they could be scapegoated too. I mean, he has no at long last, no decency. So why wouldn't you worry about that? I find that worrisome. I think that could happen.
Well, let's talk about Abraham Foxman, who was a longtime head of the ADL before its current leadership. I mean, he's spoken out against the way that the ADL has handled this, right?
Yeah, and nobody likes their predecessor telling them that they're wrong. But in this case, I think Abe Foxman is right, because he's saying, first the left was bad for Israel, and now the right is bad for Israel because they're using anti-Semitism against Americans.
Alessandra, one thing I think is very astute in your column this week is, when you talk about the Columbia student, Khalil, he may conceivably be guilty of anti-Semitism, but as you note, last time we all checked, protected free speech, protected by the First Amendment. And you also then bring up that curious point, which is back in the 70s, the ACLU went to court in order to, which is then led by primarily Jewish people, for the right of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois, right? So they have this legacy of doing that and yet protecting free speech, but Trump, as you note, is kind of wrapping this up in, I'm going to protect the Jews, right?
That's what I could foresee, is that he would go after the CLU retroactively and say, you defended neo-Nazis and I'm coming after you. And of course they did defend neo-Nazis because neo-Nazis have a right to free speech. It's just the perversity and the twistedness of Trump that keeps confounding us. But I do think that if of all organizations that you can think of, the JDL has the most reason and the best platform to point out when he's wrong. And the fact that they're not using it, I think, is a shame.
It's so demoralizing to see all of these once great American institutions relinquish some of their moral authority, right, when it comes to their dealings with Trump. And it seems like this is what we're seeing now with the ADL. Who is anyone standing up to him in a meaningful way, sort of on a civil liberties front?
Well, fewer and fewer. Yeah, there are columns, there are all kinds of activists. What's, to me, the scariest thing is the big Washington law firms that he has now gone after, because any case they have taken, any partner they have, any client they have that he feels wronged him in some way, he's now trying to prevent from being able to practice. And they haven't spoken out as one, right? I mean, they're waiting timidly for something to happen. And the case that offends me the most is Arnold and Porter, because this is a famous Washington law firm that defended government employees under McCarthyism and tried to help them when they were being falsely accused or rightly accused of being communists. And they were going to take on the case of this Lebanese doctor at Brown University who was expelled. A court actually stayed the expulsion, and then that weekend, but Trump's people sent her out anyway. They ignored the order. And then the next day, I think the law firm just dropped the case, because who needs it? She needs it. I mean, she may not be a good person either. We just don't know, right? But to have some of the most powerful law firms in the world be afraid to defend her when their whole purpose in life is to defend the guilty and the innocent, right, equally, it's just a little scary.
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump's speed and efficacy are what's making this moment feel so incredibly dangerous, right? Like, none of us really, certainly no one in Washington, it seems, expected him to be acting quite so forcefully right from the outset. I mean, how much worse is it than we anticipated?
It's worse. Everybody knew it would be worse. I don't think they expected the speed and the complete cynicism. I mean, I don't think people thought, well, if there's a court order, they're just going to barrel through it and say, catch me if you can. If you disagree with a judge, you can't call for him to be impeached. There's other ways. There's lower courts, et cetera. And then Fox went after Justice Roberts. He was appointed by George W. Bush. He's not exactly a liberal judge. So, you just feel like this is out of control. And we're seeing institution after institution just kind of fall silent.
Well, Alessandra, thank you so much. That was such a cheerful, hopeful segment. And we're feeling buoyed going into the weekend.
Well, thank you.
All right, Michael, we've got one more terrible political leader that we simply must address this week, and that is our bestie, apparently, Vladimir Putin. Andrew Rivkin, a screenwriter, journalist, and Russian affairs specialist, has the inside scoop on Putin's Trump whisperer. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks. Hi.
So, Andrew, we know Trump loves nothing more than to make a deal. So tell us all about Kirill Dmitriev.
So Dmitriev is Putin's guy, Putin's lead negotiator, basically his representative envoy to Trump world. And Mr. Dmitriev, he's a very interesting pick, because if you look at Russian diplomacy in general, like Russian negotiators, everything, starting from, the Soviet times, you would see these like burly, Soviet diplomats, all very experienced, grizzled, often from the KGB, like Mr. Lavrov, who is the current Minister of Foreign Affairs in Russia. Very scary guy, but clearly decades and decades of experience in the world of diplomacy, including like Lavrov spent, I think, about 20 years as a Russian envoy to the UN. Now, Mr. Dmitriev, it's completely different. First off, he is a Stanford grad, then a Harvard grad, then a Goldman Sachs grad, and a McKinsey grad. So he has the credential of your typical finance bro, but like a very good one because he graduated with honors everywhere, scholarships, et cetera, Kremlin's golden boy. Mr. Dmitriev, he was born in 1975 in Kiev, of all places, in the capital of Ukraine, moved to the United States where he quickly got all these degrees, managed to work at these top American institutions. And then by the year 2000, he decided to move back to Russia. Well, to Russia, because that country at that point was not the Soviet Union anymore. So he moved to Russia where in the year 2000, for someone with his degree, no door was closed, basically. So he immediately becomes deputy CEO of a rather large Russian IT company. And he starts just moving up and up and up in the world of Russian business. At this point, right now, aside from being an envoy, it's a rather unofficial post, much like Steve Witkoff's, who is first and foremost a real estate developer. So same thing with Mr. Dmitriev. He rose through the ranks to become the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. It's something like what they have in the Gulf states, but a little more Russian. So a state-owned enterprise that has billions and billions of dollars that it invests and tries to attract. So he is Russia's top businessman, and his flawless English, obviously spent years working in the US, in the American business circles. And he was chosen by Putin to be the guy who speaks the language of Trump, to represent Putin.
And how long has he been in that role as the Trump whisperer of the Kremlin?
Well, his first stint as the Trump whisperer came in the mid-2010s, 2016. Actually, Mr. Dmitriev was featured extensively in the Mueller report on Russian interference in the U.S. presidential election. So back then, he was sent by Mr. Putin to meet up with Eric Prince of Blackwater, who was and is a big donor, supporter of Trump. And it is through these meetings with Eric Prince, then through Jared Kushner, Anthony Scaramucci, did Mr. Dmitriev get acquainted with everyone on the Trump team. Now, of course, in 2016 and afterwards, there's this huge, obviously, the Mueller investigation, the probe, Russiagate, as Trump likes to call it, Russia, all caps. Obviously, Mr. Dmitriev, he couldn't do a lot at the time in terms of bettering U.S.-Russia relations. Well, now the situation is completely different. Have the people who've been investigating the Russia collusion been arrested or not? By the time the show airs, probably. Mr. Dmitriev, he is a full-fledged envoy of Mr. Putin. He recently, I think yesterday, he announced that he's going to meet up with Elon Musk to discuss cooperation in space. So while he's been in the role for about 10 years, this is his star hour because there are no barriers for him in the U.S. The U.S. justice system no longer lists him as a threat.
Trump would never define his behavior as capitulating to Putin, and yet that's what we've seen. I mean, how much credit does Dmitriev deserve for all of this?
Not that much. Strangely, I don't think that anyone apart from Putin deserves this much credit because obviously Dmitriev and Witkoff on the American side, they're still envoys. They're not exactly formulating the foreign policy agenda of their respective countries. I think that Trump is absolutely sure that he's winning, that he's not just not capitulating, that he is actually, that he's being the best diplomat there is, basically Kissinger. I think Putin and Trump speak very different languages. Actually, no, they do speak the same language, but they have different goals. So with Trump, he wants to end the war as fast as possible. He wants to get that Nobel Peace Prize. And with Putin, he wants Ukraine also as fast as possible. And he's ready to make any deal. So these two people, they come from very different sides to this question. But Putin sincerely thinks that Putin wants to make a deal, and Putin's doing nothing to dissuade him of that. However, the interesting thing, and I mentioned this in the article, at this point, 3 years into the war, which was incredibly bloody for Russia, almost 1 million casualties, for not very significant gains as to compared to what 1 million casualties theoretically would get you and how great Putin thought his army was. Putin can't really be seen as someone, jumping straight into the arms of the American president, making deals, because he's a Tsar. He's a nationalist. Like, he can't be the guy who's going to be trading provinces and power plants and soldiers, et cetera, with the president of a country that only recently was supplying the bulk of the weapons that have been killing Russian soldiers. So in that sense, he has Dmitriev as this representative, as the guy who can make a deal, because like Putin's never going to go on Russian television and be like, the killing must stop. We have to make a deal. He's going to go on television and say, Mother Russia is great. We're fulfilling our destiny, et cetera, et cetera. So he has this guy as basically Mr. Dmitriev as an interlocutor who would translate Putin's imperial Russian into Trump's language of real estate and rare earth minerals, concessions, and whatnot.
And what kind of a chip is Dmitriev missing in his brain that enables him to work for someone so closely whose primary prerogative is to destroy his hometown and his home country?
I'm not sure that's a chip. I think it's an truly incredible lack of morals and principles. I spoke to some of Dmitriev's friends from his years in Harvard, and all of them said that he is one of the most charming guys you're ever going to meet. He can talk anyone into anything. He's extremely pleasant to be around, very intelligent. And every single one of his friends, it seems, they knew that, this guy, he has a really bright future ahead of him. No one knew that it was going to be on the dark side, though. No one knew that he was going to go full Putin. But I think with him, it's blind ambition. For someone like Dmitriev, who he was born in Ukraine, he studied in America, obviously. He comes to Russia in the year 2000. And within just a few years, he rises to these absolutely crazy, crazy heights. He marries a very good friend of Putin's daughter, which, aside from Harvard and Goldman Sachs, this is what really propelled him, because it made Putin trust him, essentially. People who go into the Kremlin, they come out different. And I think that he might have not really had a conscience when he came in, but when he was there, all humanity was just gone, essentially. So that person doesn't care. Right now, he's on Twitter posting dove emojis and, saying that peace is so good between Russia and America, of course, while obviously like his hometown is being bombed and he doesn't care about that. So it's a very Machiavellian choice on Putin's end to have a Ukrainian American, in a way, do Russia's bidding in these horrible negotiations.
I'm shocked that a guy who'd done McKinsey time and Goldman Sachs time and Harvard would go to the dark side. But that's, I'm skeptical. But
certainly is the first.
Yeah. No, and as you note, it's a very three-dimensional chess move by Putin to bring this guy in. And as you say in your story as well, he speaks the language of Trump, which is deal and money, and let's get down to what really matters rather than what might be essential.
Absolutely. And the interesting part is both Putin and Trump, they chose their respective envoys. So Trump chose Steve Witkoff, billionaire friend, someone who is known to make great real estate deals. I'm not sure how that translates into international relations. Not good so far, but maybe at some point better. And Putin, he just mirrors that. He looks at his opponent and he's like, well, okay, you have this businessman, you trust these people, not career diplomats. We're not going to have a career diplomat talking to you. We're going to have someone who absolutely speaks your language, but does what I tell them to do. And that's how I think it's going to be a rare earth deal, rare minerals deal. They're probably going to reach some sort of consensus on Ukraine. And obviously, Dmitriev is going to sell this, as this very pragmatic, even just purely business-like deal. But the reality is that for Putin, it's just Dmitriev is just one of the means to reach his imperial goals. And for Trump, Witkoff is just like, it's an extension of him. It's an extension of him. There's no Machiavellian purpose behind Witkoff. It's just another real estate guy who he trusts. With Putin, everything is a game, and he plans to win that game. He definitely plans to win it.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much. Great story and great analysis.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Okay, Michael, we have to move on to something much more uplifting than that. The world of film, perhaps?
Sure. I'm excited to talk about this movie. This is a great new film directed by Barry Levinson from a script by one of the great writers, Nick Pileggi, who, knows a thing or two about writing great movies. He did Goodfellas, among others. And this is a look at the true story of the mafia titans Vito Genovese and Frank Costello, who kind of ruled New York and parts of the country in the 1950s. And maybe most cool of all I could say is both roles are played by Robert De Niro. And we've got Michael Srago here to tell us all about the movie and what we can expect.
Michael Srago has been a film critic for Rolling Stone, Salon, and Film Comment, and he's also the author of Victor Fleming, an American Movie Master. Welcome, Michael.
Good to be here.
So, Michael, we have a new film by the great Nick Pileggi. To what do we owe this honor?
Well, I think, Nick Pileggi wrote a great script. I think the honor goes to Barry Levinson for sticking with it for years and years through delays, through the pandemic, and really making an extraordinary casting coup in casting Robert De Niro as both Vito Genovese, the hot-headed, ambitious, paranoid, envious Don, and Frank Costello, who is known as the Prime Minister of the Mafia, and seeing him play these two very different roles and bring, just extreme changes in attitude and style to each of them while remaining actually visibly De Niro, kind of raises all sorts of questions about how two different personalities can emerge from such common material. I think it's a fascinating feat of acting and movie making.
So why did this film take so long to get made?
I don't know. It was originally rooted about in the mid-'70s. There was a talk of doing it then in 2019, but the pandemic ensued, I think, was a big problem with once it really got on rollers. I think then it just became why we're seeing it so late. I think it was in the can for a year. I don't know why. They were just waiting for the right time to spring it on us. People didn't know what to make of it. I think it's a very original film. I think it's not a brooding, end of the mob, meditative saga like The Irishman. It's much more like a great old Hollywood movie that wants to sweep you up in the story of, America in the post-war era and how these two very different personalities dominated their part of it. To me, it's much like a great old Hollywood film like The Roaring Twenties. At one point we see Frank Costello watching a trailer for White Heat on his black and white television. And that's, of course, the great Raoul Walsh film with James Cagney, where James Cagney plays his most psychotic role. And obviously, we're meant to think of Frank's bête noire, Vito Genovese, as a psychotic gangster like Cagney was in White Heat. But to me, the film is much more like The Roaring Twenties, this great Raoul Walsh film from 1939, which actually coined the phrase The Roaring Twenties and popularized it and wrapped up that whole era of prohibition and bootlegging and did it with, great performances by Bogart and Cagney. And also this great interstitial stuff with mock newsreels and symbolic action. And Barry Levinson does a lot of that stuff in Alto Nights too, and it feels very fresh. It doesn't feel like he's doing The Roaring Twenties. It feels like he's doing that kind of thing in a very modern way. And so it's very exciting to see that. And, as you see the antagonism of these two mob bosses, Vito, who wants to get into the narcotics trade, and Frank, who is allegedly the model for Vito Corleone in The Godfather, saying no, he wants to stay with the traditional vices and rely on the judges and politicians that he carries in his pocket. You see all these other things happening. You see, radio giving way to television. You see the last gasp of cafe society in New York, where crime-busting radio shows are broadcast straight out of Lindy's restaurant. I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, it's full of rich detail in just about every scene.
Michael, one of the things I think is great, and just to remind people, as you mentioned, the Roaring Twenties, these were two real mafia guys who ran the city or in parts of the country. But, and just difference between them, where as they show in the film, Costello was literally on the cover of Time magazine. He was a respectable guy, or so the establishment thought. And on the other hand, Genovese, raw power and kind of down in the streets. I think, without spoiling anything with the film, is the contrast between them. And also, as you touch on. They represent this transition in time, not just, of the cities declining, but the mobs moving into the suburbs and becoming more comfortable. And it sounds like, that Pileggi sort of thing of like getting the different class stratas as well is part of this. Even as Godfather 2 showed us, right? You sort of move out into Lake Tahoe now.
Yeah, Pileggi's script is great. And they pack a lot of information into this movie. And it all comes as delightful surprises or exciting action. It doesn't come as self-conscious brooding. I mean, at one point, the five families have a meeting at Richie Biardo's place in New Jersey. Albert Anastasio walks up to the house, which is this Loco Rococo mansion. And in the front yard, there is a string of busts, painted busts, mounted on little pillars and with the names of the Biardo family. I mean, it's like something out of some, crazed kitsch Italian, mausoleum or something. And it's right in front of this guy's, mansion that he presents to the world as the greatest thing. And he was the model for Tony Soprano. A lot of it is about the marriages of these guys. Frank Costello marries a Jewish woman who is very much wanting to get him out of the family eventually as part of their bargain. And they have like a parody of 50s deluxe domesticity, living in their apartment hotel in Majestic with their two little dogs. And the contrast between that and Vito's wife, who runs a lesbian nightclub down in the village and is just as volcanic as Vito, is really hilarious. Deborah Massing is terrific also as Frank's wife, Bobby. She's full of attitude and sneers. She's her summary of Vito and Anna is, she's a moron and he's a maniac. When people suggest that she's going to, Anna's going to calm Vito down, she said, look at he's marrying himself. I mean, it's very funny. And Catherine Narducci plays Anna, and she's just a live wire. There's just a lot of vitality in the movie. It really is about the American dream in some ways. For Vito, the American dream is, we racketeers, we created our world. We have it working, however bloody and vicious it is. I like that. These WASP establishment guys, they're from another planet. They were the big thieves who took everything before we got here. Now we have to do the rackets. And Frank is the guy is, no. That's a good life. I want part of it. I'm going to be there. And sure enough, he as you say, he winds up on the cover of Time. The Time magazine cover itself is hilarious. It's like him in front of a slot machine shooting slots out. And the headline is Gambler Frank Costello. That's all he's identified as. Gambler Frank Costello. And the little quote he used to have on Time magazine, the little quote for him is, who do they think I am? Superman? So it's really an amazing picture of how much he invaded the mainstream culture.
So let's talk about De Niro. One guy playing two men. How is that? Is it distracting or is it work for you?
No, to me, it's great. I mean, I think it's almost, I'd use the word Brechtian, except that would be more pretentious than this film is. You forget that it's De Niro. I mean, no matter how much prosthetic makeup he uses or different props and costumes, he's identifiably De Niro. But what he's doing is giving you, two different personalities and asking you to consider how these guys who came from the same basic place, ended up so differently. And it really is a triumph of, dual temperament. I mean, Vito is just close to the surface. He has no filter. He comes out with anything that comes into his head. And Frank is deliberative, cautious, and yet has a real slyness underneath that reserve that ultimately becomes the engine of the movie. Because in the course of the movie, we see the mob really falling apart, partly because, they don't follow Frank's lead. They don't want to be stable and just rely on gambling and things that Frank could finesse with the powers that be. They want to get into narcotics. They think it's more authentic with Vito and people like that. And then the Kefauver Commission comes in and blows the lid off. And between that and the disastrous Appalachian Mob Summit, which is the climax of this movie, the headlines that arose from that showed everybody for the first time that the mob was a national organization that had to be cracked down on. So it's really, you see kind of the mafia at its summit, and then you see its utter deterioration.
Well, Michael, thank you so much.
Always great to talk to you guys.
There's only one place to discover a global snapshot of the current cultural scene: Airmail's Arts Intel Report. Our international research tool for what to do and where and when to do it is user-friendly, continuously updated, and meticulously curated. Arts Intel is handy at home, on the road, and when you're planning your next trip. It also includes indispensable lists of restaurants and hotels in key cities around the world, recommended by our well-traveled experts. Explore Arts Intel at airmail.news/arts-intel, and be sure to sign up for our Week in Culture newsletter, which is published every Wednesday afternoon at airmail.news/WIC. I'm Chris Garrett, an Airmail Deputy Editor, and I never leave home without it. Bon voyage.
I've been dying to ask you about a story you have in this week's issue. Almost like, I guess, would we call it secondary retail or second life? Can you tell us all about Vinted, which I never known about until you brought it to our attention?
Well, this is something that everyone in the UK and Europe is using, and everyone might be a bit of an exaggeration, but they have over 105 million users, so it is quite a few people. And it's an app. It's a peer-to-peer app for selling clothes you no longer want or need. And I discovered this through a friend of mine who said, oh, you really should think about getting your daughter's Halloween costume on Vinted. It's much better than purchasing something on Amazon. And I said, what on earth is this? And I looked, and it's just this massive online marketplace, and it's incredibly easy to buy and sell used clothing. You just upload a couple of pictures, a very brief description. It has removed a lot of the friction from the experience of getting rid of your old clothes. Like, before I used to sell things on The RealReal, and they would take a 60% commission, and they would only take things that were in absolutely perfect condition, and it was all very precious, which is a good thing, right? You want to know what you're buying. But what about all those Zara jeans that your children have outgrown, or the t-shirts that you thought were going to fit you, but it turns out don't look very good? We are all such consumers of fashion, for better or for worse, and there's so much waste in that industry. It's one of the most polluting industries on the planet, actually. So no wonder Vinted is so popular, because it has created a way for us to cycle out of those things once we no longer need them, and we ensure that they don't end up in the landfill, which is where a lot of merchandise that's donated to charity ends up. From an environmental perspective, I think Vinted is a really great solution, and it's just a very exciting, user-friendly development in technology that many people are finding a tremendous amount of value. And I'm really addicted to it myself. And the great thing about Vinted too is because they use these smaller shipping networks. So not UPS, not DHL, not even here in the UK, the Royal Mail. They're tiny little things you've never heard of called like InPost and Yodel. But because of that, it's really inexpensive to ship things, all things being equal. It's a very satisfying user experience. In my story, I said it's kind of like video games for women, especially for shopping addicts like myself. So it's a really cool, transformative technology. And now it's in the US and Canada. And I expect that it's going to be absolutely huge there as well. It turns out this company was founded in Lithuania, of all places, and it became the first unicorn company in Lithuania, meaning valued at over $1 billion. And today it's valued at $6.5 billion. Anyway, but on that note, Michael, it is the weekend. I know you've got something marvelous to recommend for us. Please.
I do. And I'll say straight up that I haven't seen it yet, as it airs this Sunday on PBS, but I am super excited to see it since I've waited about a decade for this second season of this show, Wolf Hall. Ashley, I know you spoke about it some time ago as it aired earlier, a few months ago in the UK, but now it's finally coming to the US. And if you haven't seen season 1, jump in before you do this season. This adapts the final novel in Hilary Mantel's historical trilogy, and it stars Mark Rylance as Cromwell, Damian Lewis as King Henry VIII, and Kate Phillips as Jane Seymour. I'll be watching it. Maybe we can discuss next week. We'll see. But it's called Wolf Hall, The Mirror and the Light, and it goes up on PBS starting Sunday. And you, my dear, what do you have for us?
I do have something to recommend. And once again, this is coming from Graydon. But that being said, I loved it too. And in fact, got pretty much no work done on Monday because I was watching it. It is called Douglas is Cancelled. It is a fabulous television program that's on ITV here in the UK. And you can also get it on Amazon and on Apple streaming in the US. And it is about a TV news couple. And one half of that couple is played by Hugh Bonneville, who is the Douglas in question. And spoiler alert, he gets canceled. And it is an incredibly fun show. It's not quite a comedy, not quite a drama, but it takes you into the world of television news in the UK. But, you could still apply this logic to the United States as well. It's incredibly smart, snappy, immersive, and a really fun way to escape to London, Michael. It's shot all over town. The city's looking very sexy. So it's called Douglas is Canceled. You can watch it on ITV, iTunes, or Amazon.
Nice. I'm adding it now.
Okay, well, we wish you all a marvelous weekend. Thank you for joining us. Please don't read the news except for airmail. And Michael, will you please read us out?
The Morning Meeting is produced by Airplay Productions and edited by Jesse Cannon. Our coders are Graydon Carter and Alexander Stanley. Our chief operating officer is Bill Keenan. Our deputy editors are Ashley Baker, Chris Garrett, Nathan King, Julie Vitale, and Ash Carter. Our CMO is Emily Davis, and our music supervisor is Randall Poster. Our theme music is The Cute Monster by the Buddy Collette Quintet. A new edition of Airmail is published every Saturday, so please subscribe and enjoy all of our stories on airmail.news, which we update every day. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Airmail Weekly. We will be back here, however, next Saturday with another edition of Morning Meeting. And in the meantime, be sure to subscribe at Spotify or Apple Music. But most of all, thank you again for joining us.